Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this very special episode, we have a guest host joining us today, and that is none other than Mr. Wisdom from the YouTube channel World War Wisdom. We know that many of you follow this channel, and he has all sorts of great commentary and show and tell. That may be too simplistic a way of putting it, but it really is a great World War II show and tell channel where you get into the lives and the gear and the equipment and the lifestyle of the American GI. So if you would, tell us a little bit more about your channel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am, of course, interested in World War II history and also reenacting. So a lot of the content on my channel focuses on putting myself in the shoes of some of the GIs who were fighting in World War II and kind of trying to experience those things for myself, and then I can better share them with my audience. But I also talk a lot about World War II films and breaking down details and scenes and Easter eggs that you find in those World War II films. So this is a great matchup today to be here with you. Obviously, that's something you specialize in. So I'm excited to be here looking at a movie today.
Excellent. And what scene from what movie have you chosen for us?
So we're looking at the movie Fury today, which came out in 2014.
Correct.
And we're looking at the scene where the tanks and the infantry are moving into that town, kind of clearing it out, and then clearing out some enemy emplacements and rounding up some prisoners. I think that pretty much summarizes it. And I picked that scene in particular because recently I was doing a series on my page where I posted some short videos comparing Fury scenes to actual World War II archive footage that kind of matched up and put them side by side so you could really see how the cinematography in Fury captured kind of the vibe of that late war fighting that was going on in terms of the scenery and the way the infantrymen looked when they were walking around. So I wanted to take a look at that a bit more today and break down that scene. I'm sure there's plenty of details that we'll be able to call out in there.
Yes.
And I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And hopefully sometime in the near future, we're going to be doing an even more thorough breakdown of the entire movie Fury. And for that, we will be joined by another special guest. So we'll keep that a surprise until that later point. But without further ado, let's go ahead and do a deep dive into this scene from Fury. So I really like this opening shot of the air armada because you really get a sense of this broader war that is unfolding. You really, truly get the boots on the ground perspective in this movie, but this is an acknowledgement of that much bigger conflict that's finally coming to a head here at the outset. So it's some really great detail. I really enjoy that shot. Something else that you and I referenced earlier too, this movie does have historical flaws, especially from a narrative standpoint, especially in the final acts of the film.
Right. Absolutely.
But I think one thing that you cannot argue about is the attention to production detail. As they're driving through all of this litter, all this detritus of war, all these dead horses and destruction, they really did a good job, I think. Are there any material aspects or details that stand out nicely for you?
Yeah, I do think the historical, I think a lot of history buffs like ourselves might look at this movie and see those little storyline imperfections and the many inaccuracies that are certainly present in this movie, and they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, I see this movie getting trashed a lot, and a lot of it is deserved, but also the attention to detail in the visuals in some of these scenes is really second to none. And when we see Fury driving through there, I think the design of the tank itself, and as we'll see, the design of War Daddy's character and the imagery there is very important in this. And on Fury, you have everything shows that these are late war experienced GIs. You know, they have all their stuff strapped to the outside of the tank. It gives it that lived-in look, like it's been around the block. They have those logs hanging off the side, which the logs were meant in one way to defend against certain types of projectiles and add a little bit of defense to the tank sides. But also, the training films showed that you could use logs to dislodge a tank that was stuck in the mud.
Right.
You kind of lash them onto the tracks, and that provides a little additional traction, so you can use those logs to pull yourself out of the mud. So even just looking at the tank gives us an idea that we're looking at it. It sets the scene. An experienced tank crew. We're at the end of the war, and then we have this other character, Norman, who's getting thrown into it.
And he is definitely the youngster, and I think you could very much say that all the other characters are probably anywhere from 15 to 25 years older than what their real life counterparts would be, which is a constant theme that we discuss here on Real History.
Certainly.
People are just too old to be in these certain roles.
Yeah. And then the scenery that they're driving past there, I mean, we see the desperation of Germany here, all those destroyed vehicles that they pass. They're harvesting horse meat. They're driving over dead German soldiers. And so that really sets us up for the fighting that we're about to see, where these experienced GIs are kind of moving into that town where the Germans are desperately holding on.
I got eyes on the town. We're ready to commence assault.
Baker 6 copies. Initiate your attack. Me and my boys will hit them from the south. Over and out.
So you've done a good bit of research on the tactics that GIs would use as they progressed into German communities like this. You've analyzed a lot of actual footage from the National Archives. Do you sense that this gives us an accurate perspective of how such actions unfolded?
In general, yes. You know, there are some minor inaccuracies at times, but I think some of the details that we see there, like we saw them going up and quickly searching those civilians. That's one thing I noticed in a lot of the original footage I was watching. Guys who clearly just seemed to be a local shopkeeper waving were quickly searched, had their jackets removed, and made sure that they weren't some kind of enemy combatant, because at the time here, these GIs weren't taking any chances. But I'd say the movements are pretty good. These guys are keeping their eyes open. We'll see here in a minute that once the shooting starts, everyone kind of runs right behind the tank. Right there, we see everyone's running right behind the tank, and it does make me think, well, why are they spread out at the sides of the street and not taking cover preemptively if they know they're getting this close to enemy territory? And I have seen in original footage where guys are walking on the sides of the tank, but that seems to be reserved for times where maybe they aren't anticipating a high risk of enemy contact in the immediate future, when you see those guys walking out in the open down the street.
We see Clint Eastwood's son leading the element here. And death potentially lingers around every corner.
Absolutely. A common criticism of Fury is that it looks like Star Wars with all the tracers, colorful tracers flying.
What are your thoughts on that?
I do think they're a bit over-stylized, perhaps. But when you watch original footage, you do see the tanks especially firing a lot of tracers from their machine gun. And I like that they had that scene where he's firing the 30 cal and saying, "Follow my bursts," and kind of calling out targets with the tracer rounds, which would have been common. But they maybe do look a little too laser gun-esque at times.
Yeah.
Whoa! Binkowski, see that Kraut stinger in the cellar on my left? Mind giving him what for?
We'll slap him around a little bit for you.
Well, I know what GIs would often encounter, and I think that's what we just saw in this scene here, is that they look like these almost ready-made fortifications, almost like they're bunkers built within the homes, but oftentimes what they were is that they were the coal chutes in these houses.
Yeah.
Where you'd sometimes have like steel plate doors, and then the coal man would come by, dump them down in the basement so you could put it into your furnace and whatnot. And those turned out to be almost ready-made fortifications. They would be mostly concealed underground. You could open and close the door accordingly, and it looked natural as well. So they used this urban architecture to their advantage.
Absolutely. I also liked, we saw there a guy carrying his M1919A4 30 cal machine gun. And that's not a very by the book way of using the machine gun. Usually you'd have, an assistant gunner who's carrying the gun and a gunner who holds the tripod and puts it down, which is how it was often practically utilized. But towards the end of the war especially, you see a lot of guys. I think there's a famous photo of some 83rd Infantry guys sweeping down a road much like this, and the guy's just hip firing or ready to hip fire his 30 cal machine gun.
Heading tanks, first left. Got some Willie Pete in that ground floor.
And what we see here, the Germans had put a artillery piece within a storefront window, and they get a hefty round of white phosphorus, also known as Willie Peter, and they almost look like these ghostly-like figures emerging from the smoke here. Describe for our viewers what white phosphorus did to people who were exposed to it in such a way.
Sure. So white phosphorus burns very hot, and it was used a lot to provide smoke during World War II. So these rounds were typically, I know people call out Fury wouldn't have actually been issued white phosphorus smoke rounds during the time. That's a detail that I've heard people comment on in the past, but we see them using it in this movie. But yeah, white phosphorus, it's brutal when used on infantry. And I think today, maybe it's even banned for use against personnel. I believe maybe you can only use it against vehicles and equipment, although people in the military, I'm sure there's plenty of people more qualified than me to give you that information. But once it gets on your body, it just burns, and it's a terrible thing. I've heard stories, I don't know how true it is, but about white phosphorus being used for torture and then putting it at the top of their body and letting it burn all the way through. It's a very terrible weapon to be exposed to for these guys.
They cooking. Go.
What are your thoughts on, we saw that scene there where somebody goes to shoot the guys who have this white phosphorus stuck to them, and he says, "Oh, they burning, don't shoot them."
Yeah. Well, it's a scene that's very reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan. Let them burn.
Don't shoot, let them burn.
And certainly by this point in the spring of 1945, there's no love lost between combatants. So I think that is, all in all, a very true sentiment that is being expressed.
Absolutely. And maybe even more applicable here than when we see it in Saving Private Ryan. That stuff was probably more common late in the war.
We're to halt here.
Bitte, hören Sie auf zu schießen!
And of the town burgermeister or whoever emerging from the building here with the white handkerchief, you have found footage exactly like that.
Yeah, it's very similar. And my footage, I don't think it's somebody trying to surrender their troops, but somebody coming much like this to go speak to an American vehicle crew, and he's running out in a suit just like that, waving his white handkerchiefs around.
Yeah, and probably essentially saying, "Don't destroy our town," is in all likelihood what they're arguing.
Absolutely. So here we see these German troops surrendering. Obviously, they're very young, and that's another detail that I think many people are aware of, that in the later days of the war, you did see troops like this, young kids forced into combat. But also, just in general, young or old, these troops are filing out, they're scared, they're surrendering, and I think that's something that's maybe not portrayed in all war movies, where guys surrendering are usually doing it to save their own lives. They're sometimes even relieved that they're not fighting anymore. They're scared of what's going to happen next. They're not spitting on their captors and trying to start a tussle and trying to run away and escape, or pull out a grenade or something like that. Certainly that happened at times, but I think what we see here is pretty accurate for the time that's being portrayed.
Yeah, and I think perhaps some of them are wearing like the Volkssturm armbands,
Yes.
like the People's Army.
Yeah.
And I've read in a number of accounts, I think in Stars and Stripes in particular, where the young combatants were often perceived as the most fanatical because they hadn't like yet matured and reached this point of realization yet about the war being lost, and they still had this sort of blind faith in the Fuhrer. Whereas older conscripted troops, let's say people in their 50s or 60s, who maybe had sons that they already lost in the war, they were often far more willing to surrender as far as GI perception of them went.
Yeah, that's a great point. You think about a kid this young in 1945. The Third Reich might have been all they've ever known, really. That's
true.
been around for the majority of their life.
Yeah.
They've kind of grown up with this. So to see that falling apart, maybe they're not so readily letting go of that.
Yeah.
I wish I knew more about the German uniform details. I'd love to call some of those details out on these surrendering troops. I'm not as familiar with that.
They seem all right to me. I'm more familiar, like you, with GI uniforms, but a lot of it comes down to not only what you're wearing, but how you wear it. Mm-hmm. And I think all in all, it does a respectful job.
Yeah, and in terms of the GI uniforms that we see here, I think in general, they're very well done. We see guys with the later war issue items. They're wearing the double buckle combat boots. They have the gas hoods worn over their helmets in some circumstances, which was common. They're traveling very light in most cases. They have that, maybe they have some ammo on them and some food, but you don't see them carrying packs or anything of that sort, which was common when you're going out on a maneuver like this.
A day da die Kinder gehängt?
Yeah.
Hey, shoot that guy.
This guy?
Yeah, him, the SS sucker with the busted wing.
Oh.
So leading into the town, we saw all these people hanging from telegraph poles, from utility poles, people hanging from buildings in the streets. And it really speaks to the sort of fanaticism that was being exhibited by many until the bitter end. Mm-hmm. And then we see this SS officer here.
Certainly.
Getting his just desserts
Yeah.
in retaliation.
I think that acting in that scene is a little strange to me, some of the choices that they made, where that German officer who they're about to shoot, like it seems to me like if you were in that position, you would clearly know what was about to happen. And he's standing there holding out his papers like as if he's expecting them to come grab them, you know. I don't think I would have been so calm as they said, stand here while the guy with the machine gun walks around the corner.
I think for a lot of SS guys, though, there was perhaps the foregone conclusion, hey, I'm going to die.
Right. That's very
and
true.
Maybe he's like trying to go out with a degree of chivalry and not show the white feather here and beg for his life at the very last moment.
Yeah, and I do think that was a very deliberate choice, probably. In that regard.
GIs took great joy in SS hunting.
Yep.
At this stage of the war.
Yeah, and another very accurate aspect here is as soon as that guy hits the ground, they're checking his pockets. They're probably, if he's got
Pulling
a
off his
Luger
watch.
on him, that's gone. The watch is gone. Any food in his pockets, that's not going to stick around. Like I said, these guys are traveling light. So they're looking for the cigarettes, the food, anything that they're not able to stack up on their person. They're going to pick that up on the go. And we often hear about, especially associated with this movie, the murder hobo look. You're familiar with that term?
Uh-huh.
The late war infantry who, they're living in foxholes or wherever they can. They're carrying everything they need on their person, so they call them murder hobos. Yeah. And these guys definitely capture that. They have that dirty look. And in my mind, every time I hear the word murder hobo, I picture that guy who comes out, Angel, is that his name? With the Thompson and the gas hood. I think they really capture that in this scene of the movie.
Yeah. And there's so many interesting details to dissect here. We see War Daddy, Brad Pitt's character, conversing with his commanding officer. And in a scene immediately prior to this, which we didn't get into today, but we see them executing a German who is wearing a U.S. officer's rain jacket.
Yes.
And then here in this scene, the American CO is wearing a captured German jacket, so doing the same thing. So it's these little things that lead to this sort of moral ambiguity in the narrative. And it leads to this big question, well, how much do you need to become like your enemy in order to defeat your enemy?
Yeah.
And I think that is a conversation that comes to the forefront of this movie. We also see black GIs in this movie as well, and they are serving in a somewhat assistant, perhaps a clerical capacity for the CO, which is entirely accurate in many cases. So it's great to see that more that broader network of what the American Army is at work here in some of these scenes.
And we do get a look here too at the design of the War Daddy character. He's got the captured Sturmgewehr slung over his shoulder. He's got that first pattern tanker jacket with the cross-stitched patches on it, and he's got the haircut, which is of questionable historical accuracy. Probably something more likely you would have seen on a German soldier at the time, if anything.
Right.
But they really gave him that iconic look. And the shoulder holster, too.
Yeah, I mean, you got to go with the shoulder holster. Yeah, for sure.
That definitely sets him apart. The captured Sturmgewehr, I actually like that choice a lot for him. That would have been maybe for a guy in his role. We talk about sometimes whether or not it's accurate to have guys using captured weapons. Probably not in a lot of circumstances, but for somebody who's riding on a tank and doesn't have to worry about ammo availability, he's probably only using that in the last resort.
And I know for certain that those were coveted souvenirs.
Yep, there's plenty of photo evidence of guys walking around with those.
And I have held at least 2 of them in the collections of museums. Somehow, guys smuggled them home. I've held them in my own hands.
You guys find a way. They'll get
at museums.
Yeah.
And sometimes their kids or their grandkids are like, after Grandpa passes away, like, I kind of don't want this in my house because it's of questionable legal status. Right. And so they find that the best way is to give it to a museum. And let them worry about it. But it's an incredibly valuable weapon if you're able to find one and get your hands on one today.
I want to show you something.
So now we are stepping into the office of the local party members, and as we can see, they have taken their own lives rather than suffer the humiliation of defeat. Have you been able to encounter any first-hand accounts like this or similar incidents as depicted here?
Of course, there are documented cases of similar things happening, but I can't think of a specific circumstance where it was like this, where the GIs are kind of uncovering the scene of these guys who have taken their own lives. But I do like that they included this scene. It's just another aspect in showing that, at this point, Germany's kind of crumbling, but even though their officers are to the point of killing themselves because of the dire situation they're in, these GIs are still losing their lives fighting them, trying to pound them into giving up and ending the war. So even though things have devolved to such a bad point for Germany, the fight still continues.
Why are you showing me this?
Ideals are peaceful. History is violent.
It's a very fitting line to conclude with, about ideals being peaceful and history being violent.
Right.
What do you think the filmmaker is trying to convey in scenes like this when we put it in the context of the final weeks of the Third Reich?
Yeah, like we were kind of discussing, Germany at this point is crumbling, and they're kind of facing the violence that they were putting forward. You know, you talk about the ideals that the Third Reich was kind of known for and perpetuating, and they were the aggressors for most of the war, and now we see them kind of getting I guess a taste of their own medicine, or having things come full circle, where now Germany is the place that's being destroyed, and we see these high-ranking German officials being killed, as opposed to, you know, the German conquests that we saw early on, where they were pillaging and taking over Europe.
Yeah, and how I often interpret it as, by and large, up until this point, the character of Norman has been very timid about carrying out his duties, and War Daddy is essentially saying that this is a shooting war. You're going to have to get your hands dirty. There's no such thing as a pacifist or peaceful person out here.
Yep.
So it serves as yet another rude awakening for this once naive young man.
Absolutely. So in the background here, we see there is a German Schwimmwagen that still has its German camouflage paint job, but it has the U.S. star painted on the side. And at this point in the war, stuff like that was very common, especially with certain divisions. The 83rd Infantry Division became known as the Ragtag Circus because of the way they would pick up enemy vehicles. There are cases of them having, I think, Kubelwagens and half-tracks, all captured from Germans, and they would pretty much just usually give it a coat of OD paint. Here we see they didn't do that, but especially painting that star on it so everyone knew it was ours now, and then using that to continue the drive forward. So it's a neat little detail in there. I also love that in these last couple scenes, it's pretty accurate in showing, I mean, what's the first thing that we see all these GIs doing when the fighting stops and they're in this town? They're all drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, talking to the local women.
Fraternizing, yes.
And that is pretty accurate for this. And when you look at historic footage, you know, they go into a town like this, of course they're finding plenty of wine and spirits, and they're getting their cigarettes out, they're stopping for a snack and a drink, and those little moments are very common there.
Anything is fair game.
Yeah.
Yes. So, as we said before, this is a movie that has its share of flaws. Yeah. I have spoken to real-life veterans of the Tank Corps, and they have very mixed reactions. Some of them love the sort of contested camaraderie and colorful banter that you see in the film. They think that part is very accurate, but they very much cringe at some of the later scenes depicting tank combat, including the absolutely ridiculous, over-the-top finale of this movie. But all of that said, I think both of us have come to the consensus that the scene that we have just analyzed here has more strengths than it does weaknesses.
I agree. Overall, the movie, it's a mixed bag, and maybe there's more bad than good in there. But the part we just watched, I think it's fairly historically accurate, and certainly in terms of the imagery and the appearance of everything, I think it's very well done.
So there you have it, an in-depth analysis of some of the street fighting scenes within the movie Fury. Stay tuned on our channel for an even further in-depth investigation of the film in its entirety. But we thank World War Wisdom for joining us in this special session, and I think it's a good foundational moment for future conversations, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do it again. Remind the good folks of where they can find you and what you offer.
Absolutely, yeah. So thanks so much for having me today. I had a lot of fun going through that movie together and hearing your insight. If you guys want to see more of my content and what I put out, which is a lot of breakdowns and war details, kind of like I was giving today, and also World War II reenactment footage and those kind of firsthand experiences. Feel free to check me out on my channel. It's World War Wisdom on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. So yeah, at World War Wisdom, type it in and you'll find me.
A lot more multifaceted than we are here, but we'll get there someday, I have no doubt. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Real History, and until then, stay curious.